Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back. And this is our last panel for this conference. It's entitled Interpreting the Qur'an. Necessary, impossible, inevitable. And we have a wonderful line of panelists and a very respected responder, so it's going to be an exciting concluding session. I would first like to invite Zainab Al-Alwani, one of the organizers of this conference. She is an assistant professor of Islamic Studies at the Howard University School of Divinity, which is where we are at. She is an Islamic scholar, researcher, and community activist. In addition to being the first female jurist to serve on the board for the Fiqh Council of North America, her research interests include Quranic studies, Islamic law, family law, comparative religions, and interfaith dialogue. She is, as I mentioned, one of the organizers of this college, and we've been seeing the tireless work that all three organizers, chief organizers, have been putting in, Yunus Mirza and Dr. Alwani, as well as Maria de Cake. So as we welcome the first panelist to come and talk on the topic of contemplating the Qur'an, themes of Surah Al-Hujurat, I ask for a big round of applause and thanks also for the conference.
Assalamu alaikum. Peace be upon you. And thank you very much for coming to our conference and make this conference wonderful by the attendees, participants, by also the hosts and the staff of the School of Divinity. So I thank you all. Thank you. There is a consensus among scholars throughout the history of the Ummah that interpreting the Qur'an through the Qur'an, tafsir al-Qur'an bil Qur'an, and you heard this many times in our conference, is the most accepted method of interpretation that requires a comprehensive reading to analyze context and meaning. What does a comprehensive reading mean? Scholarly interest in understanding and implementing this methodology goes back to, of course, it's Prophet Muhammad was the first one who really paved the way for Muslims to use this methodology, but it really goes back to substantial commentary of Al-Fakhr al-Razi. Fakhruddin al-Razi, in his Tafsir al-Kabir, or Mafatih al-Ghaib, he's the first one, maybe he started this. In order to understand the structure of the Qur'an, al-Razi tried to explain the relations between the subject matter of the preceding and the following sections at times on a broad thematic basis, and at other times by trying to find hidden clues, thematic and linguistic, to link between the sections and indeed between the verses and even the words of the Qur'an. In the modern time, many scholars attempt to interpret the Qur'an through the application of the concept of the unity, as we explained, and also today we heard about Sayyid Qutb and also Islahi yesterday. Application of the concept of the unity of the text and wahda al-biyaniyya, or the idea of the organic unity, that finding a core theme that links and related passages of a given surah. Each Quranic surah has a central idea as its unique message. This entire chapter or surah will revolve around this core idea despite the apparent diversity of its verses and segments. However, when one reads the Quran analytically with the chapter's core concept in mind, it is not difficult for the reader to then draw links between those diverse segments of the surah. Those diverse segments of the verses of the surah within the surah serve to elaborate, exemplify, or explain the core concept of the surah. There is also the methodology of tracing the use of certain words throughout the Quran and then comparing the different meanings and functions of a specific word in different contexts throughout the Quran. And we heard so many of your presentations based on this. This methodology also helps link certain passages that might appear unrelated or distinct in meaning, deriving many aspects about one specific concept, such as tawbah, repentance, by asking different questions, and then at the end maybe you come up with a model about this concept. Therefore, I use Surah Al-Hujurat as a methodological model to interpret the Quran through the Quran. It's just a trial, and highlight its major themes. This surah was 108, number 108, revealed in Medina in the year 9 after Hijrah, almost at the end of the Prophet's life, after the conquest of Mecca. The title of this chapter is derived from the mention of this word, Al-Hujurat, in verse 4. I also believe in this, every title of the surah has a meaning, and there is a connection between the title of the surah and the core concept of or the mahwar of the surah. Surah Al-Hujurat presents models on human relations. Maybe you read in some of the translations, it's more about ethics more than, of course, human relations is one thing. It stresses the concept of social ethics and the principles that humanity needs to cherish in order to build a harmonious human society. These ethics and principles that were revealed in the latter stages of the Prophet's mission offer an overview of the many essential characteristics for human relations on different levels. It establishes the foundation upon which the Ummah, which we heard about this morning, must be based, from emphasizing the characteristics of a true believer toward God and His Messenger, to outlining the moral values that are essential to society, to social harmony. I was able to derive 10 themes or models that either strengthen or weaken human relations. But for the sake of time, of course, I chose only 3 themes or models for this presentation. One is, I can consider it as a foundational model, and the other 2 are preventive models. I will not explain, of course, the linguistic aspects in this presentation, maybe just a few, as it is explained in my paper, but because I would like really to focus on some of the social and political implications at our time. And in this case, it's just what I came across, at least for now. The first theme, I thought this is the first model on human relations between God and His Messenger, and of course between us as believers and His Messenger. The Surah Al-Hujurat, starts the first call, that loving call that aims to alert the hearts of the believers. It is an address by God to those who believe in Him, touching their hearts, oh, who you believe, by highlighting the bond they have with Him, reminding them of their contract with Him, which is related to the verse Amana, and that's when, it goes in Surah Al-Ahzab 33, when God took this covenant with the humans. This call was mentioned 5 times within the 18 verses. And I'm sorry, I forgot to have the ayat. I have it as a PowerPoint, but I forgot to have them on the screen. All believers don't make any suggestion or forward to God or His Messenger. This is the first ayat of Surah Al-Hujurat. Surah Al-Hujurat is number 49, and this is number 2. This is verse number 1. Number 1, any of your affairs or of life in general, don't attempt to judge any matter unless you first refer to what God and His Messenger say. It is a complete submission to God. It's an ultimate submission to God. In this case, we don't come to the Qur'an, for example, with our previous assumptions and suggestions before reading the Qur'an and listening to it. So the complete submission is when we come to the Qur'an first, listen carefully to God's word. We read and reread several times in order to understand his message. Then from there, we generate our questions and ideas based on what he's saying. And in this case, that's when we generate our question as a result of our serious engagement with the Qur'an. We see that it is all a question of psychological attitude defining the standards to be observed in relation to God and his messenger, and the process by which instructions are received and carried out. This quality stems from the awareness that God hears all and knows all. The meaning of submission to the first community, to the companions, was an ongoing process to being tested at all levels in order to be purified holistically. What I mean by holistically here is that all aspects of the human being and his or her relations underwent this process of purification. In this case, the meaning of being tested is an intensive training session that may elevate the person or a community to a higher level. One aspect of chapter al-Hujurat or Surah al-Hujurat is that it elucidates a model for the companion's relationship with the Prophet by establishing a protocol for addressing the Prophet, how to address the Prophet. In this case, how the Prophet's companion spoke to the Prophet in manner and form was considered as part of a trial or test to the believers in manifesting their respect for the Prophet as they interact with him. The Qur'an situates itself as a role model in addressing the Prophet and all the preceding prophets and messengers by calling the Prophet, O Prophet, O Messenger, Ya Ayyuhan Nabi, Ya Ayyuhan Rusul. And of course, any human relation takes two folds. The Prophet's relations towards his companion is described in Surah 3, Ayah 159. And then when Allah or God, and it was by God's grace that you, O Prophet, did deal gently with your followers. For if you had been harsh and hard of heart, they would have indeed broken away from you. So forgive them, pray that they are forgiven, and consult them in all matters of public concerns. Then when you decide upon a course of action, place your trust in God. This is a comprehensive model for the relationship between a leader and people. The model of a mutual respect, love, and mercy may apply in every human relations, such as parent-child, maybe relations, teacher-student, or any other relations. Surah Al-Fatih, which is the chapter or the surah that precedes the one we are discussing here, Surah Al-Hujurat, presents the experience of companions that the Prophet's decision, when they, the end of the surah, Surah Al-Fatih, the previous one, is very well connected with the following surah, Al-Hujurat, 49, and the previous one, 48. The idea stresses is that Muhammad is God's messenger, the messenger of God, and those who are truly with him are firm and adhere towards all deniers of the truth. Then the model, of course, the believing men and women have responsibility towards their prophet. So in this case, the connection, it comes first from the prophet, how he act and interact with his companions and followers, and in return, that's when it comes with the believers. And the second model, which is this is first 6, it's a preventive model on preserving human dignity and honor. This word, it's Ayah 6 or verse 6. it mentioned fasaqa, and the root of fasaqa occurs 54 times in the Quran, in 4 derived forms, 10 times as the form, one verb, and the other 30 times are an active participle. Ar-Raghib al-Asbahani, one of the Imams, mentions that the Arab did not use fusq, the word fusq, for a person. The Quran is the first to use that term in this regard. The Arabic word used by the whole Quran in speaking of the disobedient is al-fasiqun. Its roots being fasaqa, which means to go outside, or the one who departs from the right way or the truth to stray beyond limits. The traditional tafsir circulated a story that was mentioned about this as a reason of revelation. Is about one companion, Al-Walid bin Uqba, who was sent by the Prophet to collect the zakat from one tribe. And he got afraid of them. So before he really reached the tribe and gathered the zakat, he went back to the Prophet and told him that they didn't give me the zakat. So the Prophet, of course, he was angry with them. But then they came back and clarified. That's the story. But Ar-Razi, he analyzed this reason of revelation, and he established his argument on the issue as following. And he said, any verse, its implication is general and not restricted to specific reason. 2, people must remember that the ayah or the verse was revealed on that occasion instead of saying that it was revealed for the occasion or reason. So he was trying to say, and try also to analyze this, we shouldn't even say about this person as fasiq. He was the companion himself, because in this case, in that what the Quran is saying, not in the Quran nor in the Sunnah mentioned anything about this person as fasiq. And based on his research, Ar-Razi's research, on fasiq, the word fasiq, throughout the Quran, so he came out with something different. And he refuted even the theological debate about this. So this is just, he also linked, of course, with the Surah Al-Fath and the believers. So he said the believer is strong and will prevent and block the fasiq, or anyone who comes with false news to his community, someone who comes with false truth from the telling him a lie. And of course, the testimony of the fasiq cannot be accepted based on Surah chapter 24, ayah 4, and that's another thing to deal with. The chapter also, and in this case, I just for the sake of time, I invite all of you just to reflect on chapter 24 and connect this ayah of Surah Al-Hujurat with chapter 4. But I will try to go back to the main conclusion, I guess also it comes here. The experience itself of the story of the wife of the Prophet to be slandered by someone who came with a false truth about her, it was a test and for the first community. And that was, again, it was a very, very intensive one. The experience itself, of course, it was also mentioned, Surah An-Nur, or 24, it was before Surah Al-Hujurat. So now, for this model, there are so many methodologies and we can derive from this issue. How do you deal with someone who comes with false knowledge, false news? How do you deal, how much it affects your community? How much it affects you as an individual. So that was the experience of the first community by really testing, not anyone, but with the wife of the Prophet himself. What is our take on this verse? in our time. Let's evaluate our social and political system and organizations based on this model. Media, political campaigns, education system, legal systems, even family and communal behavior. Could we highlight the areas that encourage this type of behaviors? Someone will come with long stories and then it becomes a news, and that's what everyone believed without even trying to investigate or find the truth. I'm almost there. Give me 2 minutes. I would like also to include this with the third model, which is also another preventive and comprehensive model on the role of ethics on preventing violence and maintaining psychological and social stability. This one is also in the same surah, but the verse is 11. And then here it says, "O you believe, let not some men among you laugh at each other. It may be the latter are better than the former. Not let some women laugh at each other. It may be the latter are better than the former. Nor defame, nor by sarcasm to each other, nor call each other by offensive nickname. Seeming is a name connecting with wicked names to be used of one after he has believed. And those who do not deceive are indeed doing wrong." In this surah really established a very ethical and very strong statement that these include the prohibition of spying, defamation, ridiculous others, backbiting, insulting others, avoiding suspicions toward each other, and the obligation to verify the accusers of any information one receives. And verbal or emotional abuse is a serious crime, sin that destroys any person emotionally. It is tragic, and this is a point that by going across the Quran, I found this. It is a strategy that all preceding nations have used against all the prophets and messengers from Moses to Muhammad. It is a very effective strategy to destroy a person for many reasons. Making fun of people was a strategy applied by all the nations who rejected the prophets and messengers. Why? What is the effect of this strategy on the person emotionally and psychologically? And how does it affect his or her actions and behavior? What does the field of mental health teach us about this, or the other field? It is an attitude that allows the person to see himself above the others, losing respect of the people to the person, making the person doubt his abilities and qualifications. So the Quran encourages establishing institutions that educate people to prevent this type of attitude. Parents, educators, politicians, mental health advocates, media, and other social institutions should be working hard to develop systems and programs to help and train children and adults to prevent having this type of attitude. Our modern society, it has become the norm of to promote this type of attitude, whether among the political campaigns, sport, media, and that type of single attitude affect young people in schools and educational system, and we know the stories. Finally, I know I'm taking advantage of being an organizer. Please forgive me. The conclusion, I like this ayah, the last verse I have here. It's 49:13. This is my favorite ayah, and usually all mankind or humankind. Behold, we have created you all out of male and female, and have made you into nations and tribes, so that you might come to know one another. Verily, the noblest of you in the sight of God is the one who is most deeply conscious of Him. And this is, interestingly, this verse directly follows the two verses we just mentioned. Regarding, this is of course 11 and 12, and this is 13, regarding avoiding suspicion and preventing the derogation and defamation of others, which we established is a form of emotional abuse. After first commanding people to avoid suspicion, name-calling, backbiting, and everything there, it then established the fundamental fact that all people are equal they originated from the same source, are created in the same fashion. No person has any superiority over another. This concept fundamentally, of course, changed how pre-Islamic Arabian society operated, as they valued people based on superficial external things like their clan, race, wealth, gender, and other. Second, this verse 49:13 establishes a human diversity as a product of divine wisdom, so that you might come to know one another, as reflected in this verse. Third, by establishing the coming to know one another is one of God's objectives for diversifying His creation. Human beings are then ordained with responsibility to learn about the others. And finally, the Qur'an created a new standard for measuring the merit of human beings, rather than looking to people's financial status, race, and other things. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just so you know, the yellow things I'm showing is 5 minutes left, and then I'm finished with a smiley.
There's no reason to share that with them. You can say good job or something.
Oh, okay, I'll like that next time. Yes, but I'm afraid I have two organizers here, so. Our next speaker is Amr Osman, and he is here all the way from Qatar University, where he serves as assistant professor of Islamic history. He earned his PhD from the Department of Near Eastern Studies at Princeton University in 2010. His research interests include the intellectual history of Islam, as well as the modern and contemporary Arab politics and thought. He will be talking to us today about the following topic: is there a literal reading of the Qur'an? The myth of literalism of Zahirism.
First of all, I would like to thank Yunus and Zaydan for inviting me to this conference. And I apologize if I fall asleep in the middle, because I just came from a very long trip. It's reported that when the Prophet Muhammad decided to fight the Jewish tribe of the Banu Qurayza, he said to his companions, do not pray the afternoon prayer except in the abode of the Banu Qurayza. The companions understood this command in different ways. One group of them took it to mean that they should pray the afternoon prayer only when they reached the Banu Qurayza, even if this meant praying it after its prescribed time. Another group inferred that what the Prophet actually meant was that they should not waste any time in setting off to the battlefield. According to this latter understanding, the companions were being requested to hurry, but they were nonetheless supposed to pray the afternoon prayer at its due time. The Prophet was silent on the matter and did not reprimand either those who saved their prayers on time or those who waited until they had reached their destination in the evening. This report is a classical example to which medieval Muslim scholars frequently refer to demonstrate two points. The first is that differing conclusions would ensue from sound ijtihad. Since the Prophet did not tell either group that they were wrong, it must have been the case that neither was. Secondly, this report illustrates the difference between the literalists, or those who adhere to the letter of commands or laws in general, and those who pay more attention to the objectives which they seek to realize. Arguably, the latter understanding fared much better in Islamic legal history, Islamic history than the former. However, the former, the literalist approach, has not been categorically dismissed. For a report like the one just mentioned lends credence to this mode of understanding religious texts. Just as some companions were more interested in the objectives of the Prophet's command, others were more interested in obeying the letter of his command. Both groups were sincere even when they proceeded along differing lines. Accordingly, two broad categories of Quranic interpretation have been distinguished. The first is literalist, which purportedly adheres to what the Quran literally says, whereas the second seeks to identify its intended meaning, taking into account its spirit and the higher goals. Zahirism is generally considered the foremost representative of the first category, whereas all other schools of law belong more or less to the other category. This categorization, however, sidesteps many questions, such as what is literalism? Can any text be read literally? And did Zahiri scholars actually read the Quran literally? To answer these questions, I will present modern views on the meaning of literalism and the possibility of literal reading of any text, followed by examples of the interpretation of some Quranic verses by the prominent Zahiri scholar Ibn Hazm al-Andalusi. I seek to demonstrate that Ibn Hazm did not read the Quran according to the rules of literalism, no matter how literalism is defined. In fact, he even rejected what would be considered a literal reading of some Quranic verses, regarding this reading as absurd and unfounded. But let me give you a very brief overview of the Zahiri school of law first. The Zahiri Mazhab is a medieval Sunni legal school that was once among the leading mazhabs in the range of its geographic distribution and reported is the official madhab of some Muslim dynasties. Dawood al-Zahiri died in the year 270, 883 in Baghdad. He is generally considered its founder, but the Andalusian Ibn Hazm died 456, 1064, remains its most important scholar, and his legal writings remain our main source for Zahiri views. By the 10th, 16th century, polemics of scholars belonging to other mazhabs had succeeded in eliminating the Zahiri mazhab, but never in completely effacing its memory. Among the numerous reasons for this polemics was the Zahiri view that only things that are explicitly prohibited by the Quran, that are explicitly prohibited by a proven legal text, be it the Quran or Hadith, are prohibited. Everything else is not. And we cannot and need not find out the rationale of these prohibitions or permissions. Zahir is referred to Quran 2:29, Surah 2, verse 29. He it is who created for you all that is in the earth. هو الذي خلق لكم كل ما في الأرض. And Quran 6:119, He, i.e. God, has explained to you in detail that which is forbidden unto you, which demonstrate in their view that if something is not prohibited, it's illegal according to the text of the Quran. As a result, Zahir is considered lawful things that other mazhabs found contradictory to common sense and sound understanding of religion, which led to the perception that Zahiris engaged in blind following of the texts without consideration of their purposes or maqasid. Zahirism was therefore branded as rigid and deficient literalism. Zahiris, say some medieval scholars, did not qualify as fuqaha, for fiqh requires more than the mere identification of the surface meaning of religious texts. And today, most people understand literalism or the literal meaning to be the plain or obvious meaning. But again, nobody tries to basically explain what the plain or obvious meaning of anything is. So what is literalism? Today, there are two main theories in the study of human language. The first is formal semantics, which assumes that language has an independent existence that allows it to carry and convey meaning, regardless of the intention of the speaker or the context of speech. This approach focuses on the semantic meaning of words and rules of syntax when interpreting any text. The meaning of a sentence is determined by the meanings of its parts and the way they are put together. The other theory is pragmatics, which insists that language makes sense only when in use, Pragmatics does not deal with sentences, it deals with utterances, the meaning of which depend primarily on the context of use. For a pragmatist, the source of linguistic data is a speech act, where a speaker S makes an utterance U in language L to hearer H in context C. This context consists of the physical setting of the utterance, i.e. the time and place in which S utters and H hears or reads U, which is utterance, and the textual environment in which a certain utterance appears, and what some scholars call the word spoken of, which basically provide an infinite number of assumptions about the larger context or background information needed for an utterance to make sense. Because of the centrality of context in this theory, it's regarded as contextualist theory. On the other hand, semantic theory corresponds to the notion of literalism. Literalism, however, is a very elusive concept. Linguists have put forward various definitions of it. Delving into the details of this controversy is beyond the scope of this presentation, but we can note here that all define literalism in terms of its relationship to the various contexts of speech. Literalism seeks to minimize or disregard context sensitivity by focusing on the semantic interpretation of words and sentences, and insists that we appeal to the speaker's meaning only if we must. But this notion of literal meaning has been questioned by many scholars who insist that any understanding relies to varying degrees on the context of speech. For example, the French scholar François Recanati points out that while in ideal cases of linguistic communication, the speaker means exactly what she says or he says, in real life what the speaker means typically goes beyond or otherwise diverges from what the uttered sentence literally says. In such cases, the hearer must rely on background knowledge to determine what the speaker means. In this view, what is said, i.e. the sentence, does not have to correspond to what is meant or communicated, which is utterance. One sentence can be used in various contexts where each use of the sentence is a distinct utterance to communicate different things, even if the words and syntax of the sentence are the same. For example, Muhammad is a prophet is a sentence, but before we know who Muhammad is, it doesn't mean much. For it only means that somebody named Muhammad is a prophet. However, when a person like Abu Bakr, the Prophet Muhammad's companion, goes to one of his Quraysh tribesmen and says to him Muhammad is a prophet, the sentence becomes an utterance, as context now. But its meaning differs from a situation where a person goes to Abu Bakr and asks him, does Muhammad communicate with God? And Abu Bakr answers, Muhammad is a prophet. Here, the sentence communicates something other than what it apparently says. That is, yes, Muhammad does communicate with God because Muhammad is a prophet. In this example, what is communicated or implicated, implied, this is implicated verb that's used in linguistics, is different from what is said. The distinction between what is said and what is implicated assumes that we can distinguish between the linguistic meaning of a sentence and what it intends to convey in different contexts when it's uttered. But in Recanati's view, there is no such thing as what the sentence says, in the literalist sense. That is, no such thing as a complete proposition autonomously determined by the rules of the language. In order to reach a complete proposition, proposition basically means a sentence that we can describe as true or false. In order to reach a complete proposition, he contends, we must appeal to the speaker's meaning. In this view, literalism is illusory, and the notion of what the sentence says is incoherent, for what is said is nothing but an aspect of speaker's meaning. I will take advantage of the fact that
you go from Qatar, yes. But it says good job.
Recanati adds that, or basically here speaks about what he calls the primary pragmatic processes, which are neither conscious nor inferential from his point of view. They take place unconsciously at the same time the literal meaning of a sentence is construed and don't even require reflection on the part of the interpreter. In other words, he argues that some pragmatic processes, which are not linguistically required to make a sentence propositional and thus meaningful, have to be made and are usually made unconsciously. So let us consider Ibn Hazm's interpretation of some Quranic verses to see to which extent they relate to these views. In Quran 12, the Surah Yusuf, the Prophet Jacob asks his son about their brother Benjamin, and they tell him that he was arrested for stealing the cup of the king when they were in Egypt. Because Jacob was suspicious of them, they said, ask the town where we were and the caravan in which we have returned. اسأل القرية التي العير التي أقبلناها. Ibn Hazm refers to these to two interpretations of this verse. According to the first one, what is meant here are the people of the village, اسأل أهل القرية, and the travelers in the caravan. The second interpretation is that given that Jacob was a prophet, had he asked the village and the caravans themselves, they would have miraculously answered him. These two interpretations, Ibn Hazm argues, are valid and possible. But it's evident that he is more inclined to the first one, admitting that some components of the idea being expressed here, the people of the village and travelers, are missing in the verse. And these are the people of the village and the travelers and the caravan. And rejecting what would be the literal meaning that requires appealing to a different word, a word of miracles. The same applies to Quran 2:93. That's Surah 2, Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 93. And zakaf was made to sink in their hearts. وَشْرِبُوا فِي قُلُوبِهِمُ الْعِجْلِ. Ibn Hazm points out that the verse does not mean zakaf itself, but rather the love of zakaf which God made to sink into the hearts of the disobedient Jews. In these two verses, there is a relation between what is literally expressed and what is implicated and understood, although they are two different concepts. In both interpretations, Ibn Hazm seems to favor interpreting the verses according to the precepts of our word and rejects their possible literal meaning. Another example, or in fact, let me go to this one. Quran, Surah 46, verse 25, says, تدمر كل شيء بإذن ربها, destroying, i.e. the wind destroys everything by the command of its Lord. Ibn Hazm argues that we conclude from the fact that the wind did not destroy everything on earth, that this verse only means everything that the wind passed over, or everything of the things that God has ordered it to destroy. So, just as the literal meaning of a sentence like everyone went to Paris, for example, is not even considered because we know that in no certain point in time, all living people went to Paris, so is the meaning of kulla shay in this verse. I mentioned this example because it was mentioned by Rebecca. So here, we do this unconsciously, we don't even need to think about it, because we know that it never happened in the past, that at a certain point everybody went to Paris. In both cases, however, we don't need to appeal for any context for the sentence to be propositional. In theory, both could mean just what they say, that everybody at a certain point went to Paris, and that the wind destroyed everything. However, we unconsciously sense absurdity in what they say and appeal to the eternal knowledge to identify the implicated or intended meaning. There are other similar examples, and there are other examples, in fact, that shows that Ibn Hazm relied on not just the textual context of the Quran, but on his understanding of some social and theological issues to understand the Quran, and in all those instances, he actually diverged from what we would consider the literal meaning of the Quran. So Ibn Hazm does not read and does not pretend to be reading the Quran solely on the basis of its linguistic or semantic meaning. He believes that the Quran is to be read pragmatically within a wider context of history, theology, and reason, among other things. So what does Ibn Hazm say about the Banu Qurayza hadith then? In his view, the hadith does not support whatever Muslim scholars used it to prove. In his view, all scholars were wrong when they thought that the difference between the two groups was due to the way they construed the Prophet's command. They were also wrong when they thought that the Prophet's report or reported silence meant that both groups were right. How is that so? Ibn Hazm argues that what the Prophet's companions were dealing with in that case was a case of ta'arud al-adillah, conflicting pieces of evidence. When conflicting pieces of evidence exist as to a specific issue, the companions knew that there was a general command that prayers must be said at their prescribed times. That day, however, the Prophet gave them a command that could not be reconciled with the general command. A group of them decided to adhere to the original general command, preferring to pray the afternoon prayers at their prescribed time, while the other group followed the new command of the Prophet and prayed after sunset when they had reached the Banu Qurayza. Both Ibn Hazm's stresses were following religious commands. Furthermore, the fact that the Prophet did not reprimand either group only indicates that whereas one of them was right and the other wrong, both were sincerely seeking, from his point of view, from the point of view of Ibn Hazm, one group was right and one group was wrong. There's no question about that. But the fact that the Prophet did not reprimand either group only indicates that whereas one of them was right and the other wrong, both were sincerely seeking to obey the Prophet and did not intend to disobey him, for which reason he did not need to reprimand either of them. Those companions who understood his command rightly were rewarded twice, once for practicing ijtihad and again for reaching the right conclusion, while those who got it wrong were rewarded once for exercising ijtihad. Ibn Hazm is obviously seeking here to resist understanding this disagreement between the companions in terms of their hermeneutics, a view that would legitimize multiple readings of a single text, which he is against. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ahmed. Thank you for coming so far from so far away. We have a very distinguished panel here, and our next speaker is Maria Decay. She received her MA and PhD from Princeton University. She's now Associate Professor of Religious Studies at George Mason University, right here in the area. Her research interests include Islamic intellectual history, Shiism, Sufism, and the Qur'an. Her book, The Charismatic Community, was published in 2008 by SUNY Press, and currently she is on the editorial team for compiling a study Qur'an, which is very much anticipated and inshallah will be out next year. She's also one of the chief organizers of this conference, so please give a warm welcome to her.
Thank you very much, Han, and all of you for coming, and Imam Ahmed as well for joining us. And all of the speakers have already said all of the interesting things, so there's nothing left for me to say. But what I thought I would do, we've heard a lot about different ways of approaching the Qur'an, reading the Qur'an, contemplating the Qur'an over the course of the conference. And so I thought I would talk a little bit about what the Qur'an tradition says about commenting on the Qur'an, about interpreting the Qur'an. I think it's obvious, certainly it should be obvious to all of you that whether you're Muslim or non-Muslim in the audience, that if you pick up the Qur'an, it's clearly a text in need of some kind of commentary, or let's say we're in need of commentary. We shouldn't say the Qur'an is in need. We're in need of commentary to understand it for lots of reasons. There's very difficult terminology in there, older Arabic words. And then, of course, there's just the fact that the Qur'an doesn't give context. It doesn't give a full context when it talks about the narratives of earlier prophets, and of course, it doesn't give context in a very explicit way when it's talking about the Prophet Muhammad and things that are going on in the life of the early community either. Now, from very early times, of course, people realized this, Muslims realized this, and engaged in various forms of commenting upon or interpreting or helping people understand the Qur'an. And as you all know, the two words that are most commonly used for this in Arabic are tafsir and ta'wil. Both of these terms are Quranic, although tafsir only appears once, ta'wil appears many times, I think 16 or 17 times in the Qur'an. But tafsir doesn't appear there meaning specifically commentary on a sacred text. It simply means explanation, which is its etymological meaning. Ta'wil, again, I'm sorry, as most of you know, means really to bring something back to its origin. And the word is used in the Qur'an to mean interpretation of acts or events or dreams, but also it has a wider semantic meaning as well, and I'm going to come back to that. But let me just say for now that it seems that in the earliest period of Islam, that these two terms were used almost interchangeably. So people will, let's say in early commentaries that were written, they'll sometimes be called tafsir or sometimes be called ta'wil. The two terms seem to be very interchangeable. When you have the word ta'wil in the Qur'an, commentators will frequently simply gloss it as tafsir. So they seem pretty much the same. But it seems that by about the 4th century Hijri or the 10th century CE, tafsir and ta'wil start to become a little bit more distinct in their connotation. They're never completely separate, but they're a little bit more distinct, with tafsir connoting primarily explanation of the plain sense of the verse, or the literal sense of the verse, based on received exegetical traditions from the Prophet Muhammad or the companions or the early generations, and sometimes also grammatical or philological analysis, and of course discussions about the asbab nuzul, the occasions for revelation. While ta'wil becomes increasingly associated with esoteric, symbolic, allegorical, sometimes even eisegetical or typological, in other words, non-literal forms of interpretation. And this is particularly true for those verses that admit of, by nature, several possible meanings quite clearly. Now, some forms of ta'wil were more acceptable than others. So some people use the term ta'wil to describe, for example, when it's necessary to give a metaphorical meaning to a Quranic verse in order to avoid the sort of theologically problematic literal reading. So, for example, the idea that God sits on a throne, some people say this is problematic. What does it mean that God sits on a throne? Is he only in one place? And how big is the throne anyway? And, so it's difficult, right, to imagine God having a body, because we think of God as certainly as transcending body theologically. So this can mean other things. It refers to his sovereignty and so on. It's a metaphorical reading of a verse that would be problematic if you read it literally. But it also comes to be applied to much more freewheeling kinds of symbolic or analogical readings that other people found problematic. Now, these exegetical developments should not make us lose sight of the fact that there's something at least a little bit theologically problematic with the idea of human beings offering commentary on the words of God. Right? Who can claim the authority, really, to know what God means? The Qur'an tells us that God speaks in the Qur'an in parables and metaphors. And sometimes it says specifically that this is a method, this is a metaphorical way of speaking, but it doesn't always. And who has the right to decide when God is speaking literally and when he's speaking metaphorically? Who's willing to suggest that in this particular verse, the words don't mean what they actually say that they mean? And if one says that the Qur'an needs interpretation, does it not suggest that an omniscient and omnipotent God is somehow unable to make himself clearly understood? Theologically, of course, God is capable of making himself clear. So if there is ambiguity, or multivalence might be a better word in the Qur'an, and the Qur'an itself, of course, says there is ambiguity or multivalence, then this ambiguity must have some divine purpose, even a communicative purpose. But how can such a purposeful ambiguity be reconciled with the idea that the Qur'an is a kitab al-mubin, It's a clear book. And that the purpose of revelation is to make truth clear from falsehood. For those of you who've had to, like me, struggle to learn Arabic, when it says, we put this in a clear Arabic so that you can understand, I think it would have been easier for me in English. But in any case, right? These are the kinds of theological dilemmas that, as you can see, one could come to if you push some of these questions further. Now, these theological dilemmas weren't lost on medieval Muslim scholars either, but they tended not to discuss these so much in terms of theological issues, more in terms of procedural or epistemological issues. Who was qualified to interpret the Qur'an, and how should you do it, on what basis? But there remains good reason to feel uneasy about the prospect of human beings interpreting the Qur'an. Surah 3:7, for example, tells us famously, "He it is who has sent down the book upon thee, Muhammad, therein are signs determined. They are the mother of the book, and others are ambiguous or multivalent," with the shabihat. "As for those whose hearts are given to swerving, they follow that which is ambiguous or multivalent, seeking temptation, fitna, and seeking its interpretation, ta'wil. And none knows its interpretation, ta'wil, save God." And as you all know, you can either stop there and say, "And those firmly rooted in knowledge say we believe in it, all of it is from our Lord," or you can say, "None knows its interpretation, save God and those firmly rooted in knowledge." Period, and then go on. They say we believe in it all is from our Lord. The verse quite clearly suggests that ta'wil is a tendency to which those who have deviating hearts tend to go toward, right? That this is one of the things that people who desire zayf, who desire to swerve from the right way, do. It's something that's done by people who desire fitna. That's not a good thing. And then, of course, there's just the fact that only God knows the ta'wil. And then there's the verse that Zainab mentioned in her opening statement. Well, it's not a verse, I'm sorry, a hadith that she mentioned in the opening statement, which says that anyone who seeks to interpret the Qur'an according to their own opinion, tafsir bil-ra'i, will take their seat or have their seat in hellfire. All of these are pretty strong, right? So a freewheeling kind of interpretation can lead you to fitna, it can lead you to swerving or deviating from the right path, and even to hellfire. So eventually it came to be accepted that the only commentary that was legitimate was commentary derived from the Qur'an itself, tafsir al-Qur'an bil-Qur'an, or commentary that came from well-attested, transmitted reports from the prophets or his companions and successors of the early generations, which could fall under the category of tafsir bil-Ma'thur, what's been reported. But as a result of this, and this was never exclusive or complete, but as a result of this general tendency, the companions and the successors in many ways become enshrined, so to speak, as authoritative commentators on the Qur'an, such that an ordinary Muslim who had not spent many years studying these transmitted commentaries and reports might be assumed to have no right to derive an independent meaning from his or her reading of the Quranic verses. Now, it's not my intention to dismiss in any way the commentaries. In doing this project that Mahan just mentioned, we have been completely and utterly dependent upon the commentaries. There are many ways in which the text of the Qur'an would be inexplicable to us without them. And if we just think about the long passage in Surah Ali Imran, which really is talking about the Battle of Uhud, there would be no way of understanding what that's referring to if you didn't have the commentary. So I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that I wonder if at a certain point, too excessive or exclusive a reliance on those commentaries might be problematic, and I suggest that it might for 4 reasons. I see 4 things that 4 things that might happen as a result of this. The first is that an excessive reliance on this could have the effect of historicizing a trans-historical scripture. The Qur'an is not concerned with history. In many ways, Moses and Muhammad are almost like they're sort of spiritual partners, right? I mean, the story of Moses tells Muhammad something about what he should do in terms of dealing with his people when they're giving him a hard time, right? When things are very difficult. The stories of Noah and Hud and Saleh and Lot and Shuaib and Moses are all brought together, even though there are generations between them. Because the important thing is not, well, how many generations is Hud from Saleh and who's his grandfather and this kind of thing. The important thing is exactly, I think as Salim was saying in Sayyid Qutb's work, that they're all facing the same struggle, that it's the same human struggle that comes up over and over again. And yet the commentators, of course, are very concerned, really, I think, responding to people's desires for more information, telling us the full genealogy of all the prophets and this kind of thing, which is important, you know, I mean, I guess if you want to know that, but it doesn't seem to be what the Qur'an thinks is important. And of course, the other problem with giving too much of historical context is it obscures for the contemporary reader the immediacy and the urgency of the Quranic message for them. So for example, if the Qur'an talks about the hypocrites, and you read the commentaries and it says, this is about Abdullah ibn Ubay, who lived in Medina, and he did such and such, and this or that person, then you're sort of safe. You can say, oh, right, that's Abdullah ibn Ubay, that's not me. But it obscures the fact that, look, hypocrisy happens now, and we might be hypocritical. We're all hypocritical to some extent, right, at some point in our lives. What if the munafiqun, right, what if that's also me at some point? And exactly as Faraz very insightfully talked about last time. Or the idea of shirk, right? The Qur'an talks all the time about shirk. If you read the commentary, shirk is about treating cattle a certain way and making dates, you know, idols out of dates and worshiping them and worshiping rocks. So can Muslims feel safe whenever it talks about the fact that the sin of shirk, that all sins will be forgiven except shirk, if they're not slitting the ears of cattle and making idols and things like that? Well, I don't know. I don't know. So, in any case, I think that it can have the tendency to distance oneself from the moral implications of the Qur'an, which are important. It places an intermediary between the Quranic author, meaning God, of course, and the listener or the reader, when the attention of the Qur'an seems to be direct address. We've heard about this last time, yesterday, and Sylvie's paper. The Qur'an is always turning and addressing its reader. There's so much second person, so much imperative. I mean, even if we look at a verse like sort of the Duha, Surah 93, by the morning brightness and by the night when it is still, your Lord has not forsaken you, nor does he despise you. And the hereafter will be better for you than this life. And surely your Lord shall give unto you, and you shall be content. Did he not find you an orphan and shelter you, and find you astray and guide you? This is about the Prophet Muhammad. This is about the Qur'an responding to his doubts and his concerns. But if I read this it means something else for me. So I think that's another problem. It also, and this might be a little more controversial, people might have different views, but I think it particularizes a text that's meant to be universal. Does the Qur'an belong to Muslims? Is it just something that is the Muslim scripture? I think it's hard to make that argument. It addresses all the time, Ayyuhan Nas. It addresses the Bani Israel. It addresses the Ahlul Kitab. It even addresses the Kafirun and the Jinn. Right? No one's left out. It seems to me that the Qur'an is there really, it's a dhikr lil alamin. It's a reminder for the world. And so in this sense, someone who's reading the Qur'an from a Christian or a Jewish point of view, like let's say Daniel Madigan yesterday, they can't really read it through these commentaries because it's a part of the worldview that's not theirs. Do they have the right as a Christian or a Jew to read it and say, I want to know what this says to me as a Christian or a Jew? And finally, the theme of the conference, it discourages independent thought on a scripture that I think invites, encourages, even demands that its listener or reader contemplate and ponder its meaning for themselves, that it answer the rhetorical questions that it poses. أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ الْقُرْآنَ? Do they not think? Do they not reflect or contemplate the Qur'an? Okay. Thank you. I know I'm doing a good job. That's lovely. 5 minutes. All right, I will do my best. Okay, so what do we do with this? I think one of the ways that we can, one of the places we can look to for guidance in this is the very insightful commentary on the meaning of tafsir and ta'wil given by the 4th century theologian and Qur'an commentator al-Maturidi. In his book, Kitab Ta'wilat al-Qur'an, in the introduction, he says that tafsir refers to the explanation of the literal meaning of the verses, to what does the Arabic mean, what do the terms mean, what is the sabab of the verse, what are the asbab nuzul, the occasions for revelation, and is there some hadith about how the Prophet explained this or understood this? That, he says, is tafsir. And for this reason, because this has to do with the literal meaning and historical context, that is why tafsir bil-ra'i is wrong. That is why you have to follow the companions on this, because they alone know the Arabic of that time. They alone know the historical context. They alone were there at the time of the Prophet and saw how he responded to a particular verse. So tafsir bil-ra'i is wrong because it's tafsir, because it has to do with this literal meaning that is precisely something that the companions would have more knowledge about than anyone who came later. But he says ta'wil is something different. Ta'wil is an attempt to discover the interpretation of verses that admit of multiple meanings, for which no definitive meaning can be determined. It seeks the furthest reaches of the interpretive possibilities of a given verse, and although ta'wil is a legitimate and religiously worthwhile endeavor, no single interpretation, no definitive statement about what the ultimate divine meaning of the verse is can be made through this process. Ta'wil is a process of seeking meaning, but not certainty. It is technically endless. So if ta'wil needs to bring the verse back to its origin, what's the origin of the verse? God's intention, right? So you can't get there. There's no way to actually get all the way back. So to practice ta'wil properly is to seek meaning without the expectation of the arrival at certainty. Now, in some ways, the search for meaning and the search for certainty can contradict one another. But certainly, certainty seems like a good thing. And so I don't mean certainty in the sense of certainty of faith. I'm thinking certainty in terms of what a particular verse actually means. And that can a sort of faithful certainty can coexist with an ambiguity about what a particular verse means. But most people are uncomfortable with ambiguity. I found, being a professor, no one really likes ambiguity except us, academics. We like ambiguity because when it's ambiguous, well then we have a paper we can write and present at our next conference. Everything's cut and dry. We've got nothing to write about. We lose our jobs. So we like ambiguity, right? But my students hate it. You know, they say to me, did the Prophet appoint Ali as his successor? And I say, well, there are two opinions on that. Well, they hate that, right? They don't want to hear that. They want me to tell them something they can put in their bag and go home with. But I can't do that. So I think that hesitation about ambiguity is pretty common, but there's one group of people who were comfortable, maybe even as comfortable, maybe even more comfortable with ambiguity than us, pathetic publisher parish professors as we are, was the early medieval Islamic scholars. They knew that religious meaning couldn't be delimited or be arrived at with universal certainty. That's why we don't have one school of theology in Islam. That's why we don't have one school of law in Islam. That's why if you pick up Tabari, you don't usually find one opinion about what a verse means. You usually find 2 or 3 or more. There's even different ways, right? We have 7 or 10 different ways of reciting the Qur'an. And I think this is because these early scholars had the humility to realize that their intellectual efforts could never yield absolute certain truth, and that to pick one interpretation over another was to cut off possible avenues of meaning. I'm almost out of time, I think. Oh, very good job. Thank you. Okay, I will try to be as fast as possible. I want to talk about ta'wil. I'll jump this. I think one of the ways we can think about ta'wil, if you look at the Qur'an and what the Qur'an says about it, is that it has to do with the unfolding of meaning over time. So if we think about two of the ways where it's used to mean something like interpretation, I mean, ta'wil, I should say, in the Qur'an can also mean the ultimate realization of something, right? The final disclosure or realization of something. Like if there's a warning that the prophet brings about destruction, its ta'wil is when it actually comes to pass. So I think if we take that idea, if we look at two places where it does seem to mean interpretation, in Surah Al-Kahf, in the story of Musa and the servant, or usually identified as Khidr. As you know the story, Khidr goes and he scuttles the boat of some poor people and he kills a young man, seemingly for no reason. And then he rebuilds a wall in a town where people had showed them no hospitality. And as he does all these things, Moses becomes outraged, about why would you do this? And finally Khidr decides, he's had enough of this, and he says, all right, well, we have to part, you and I, but not before I give you the ta'wil. I'm going to give you the ta'wil of what this is. Well, the boat was going to be seized by a tyrannical king, and the boy was going to grow up to be a horrible person who made his parents upset, and the wall, there's a treasure there for two orphans who was part of their inheritance. Right? But the point is that the meaning of the actions of Khidr could only be seen in the future. The boy was going to grow up to be this. The boat was going to be seized. When these two boys look for their inheritance, they're going to look there in the future. And perhaps the clearest example of this is in Surah Yusuf. So the very beginning of Surah Yusuf, Yusuf has the dream where he sees 11 stars and the sun and the moon bowing down to him. And he tells his father about this dream. And his father doesn't give him an interpretation, but he says to him, God will teach you the ta'wil ahadith, the ta'wil of either events or dreams, however you want to translate ahadith in this context. When does the ta'wil come? It comes at the end. It comes at the end when now Joseph is ruler in Egypt, and his brothers and his mother and his father all come and they bow down before him. Could Yusuf have known at the beginning? The 11 stars may have been a clue. He may have 11 brothers. So that may have been a clue. But could he have ever known that what this meant was he was going to be ruler in Egypt and his family was going to come and bow to him? Impossible! When he was in the well, it would have seemed even more impossible. But that's what it was. And so my point is it not possible that like the dream of Yusuf, the Quranic verses have meanings that the companions could never have imagined? Could there be meanings embedded in those verses that can only be realized over time? Right? So if the Qur'an says that you shouldn't walk on the earth exultantly and you should not upset the balance, right? You shouldn't upset the balance. Well, this is understood in classical times to mean, you should be fair when you put the weights and measures on the thing so that you don't cheat your customers. Well, I think it does mean that. But when I read this in the 21st century, having had snow yesterday, to me, this is about human beings disrupting the mizan set by God, disrupting the natural order through their activities. It's not possible that Tabari or Razi or Ibn Kathir could have imagined that this is what the verse might allude to. Because human beings didn't have the possibility of destroying the planet at that point. But now we do. Is there a meaning that's hidden there that only can be uncovered later? And I will.
Thank you very much. I would now like to invite Imam Muhammad Majid to deliver his response. Imam Majid is the Imam of Adam Center in Northern Virginia. He is also currently the president of the Islamic Society of North America.
Assalamu alaikum. Peace be with all of you. In the name of God, most gracious, most merciful, I don't know what to respond because it's such a very rich conversation and it's very heavy academically. And I'm a preacher, But I'd like us to say that, you know, when it comes to the Qur'an, the subject matter of the Qur'an is human being. Qur'an is about you. You may ask me how it defines the relationship between human being and God. For it describes who God is, so that human beings get to know God. Then it describes the relationship between human and the fellow human. And then it describes the relationship between human and the universe. And in those contexts, in Qur'an talks about their history, which is human life. Qur'an talks about also the unseen world and the relationship human with that jinn that we talked about. Whether it's the life to come. Therefore, the subject matter of the Qur'an is human being, which is some scholars call it jadal al-insan. You know, the dialect of the matters and ideas, and here the dialect of human being. And that's why I would like us to say that in order for us to understand the Qur'an and to address all of these issues that have been raised here, is to ask the questions why, who, and what. And the Qur'an in itself, it explains that the revelation is came from God Almighty, all wise, all knowledgeable, Al-Aziz al-Hakim, which is leave no room for somebody to question the text itself, for those who believe in the text. Before it closed the door, you cannot question the credibility and the credential of the speaker. Since you're in academic institutions, if any professor recommends any book to someone, they might need to justify to say, read this book, because the author of this book have this expertise, have this degree, and so forth. The Quran qualified from day one that the revelation comes from the one who created. The Quran is khalaq. He, the name of the Lord, the one who created. To end all the discussion that there's no one has that title to God Almighty. Therefore, the knowing the speaker is very important for knowing the words. Therefore, the Quran keeps repeating, saying, who is speaking, who's speaking, who's speaking, and that's very important. And then the Quran explains why the revelation to begin with. In many verses, Allah said, تَنْزِيلُ الْكِتَابِ مِنَ اللَّهِ الْعَزِيزِ الْحَكِيمِ. That was a book was revealed to you to can deliver humanity from darkness to light. And it says, هُدًى لِلْمُتَّقِينَ is guidance to righteous people. It says, هُدًى لِلنَّاسِ guidance to humanity. And therefore the Quran, in many verses, explains the purpose of the book. And then the Quran, they said, that telling us the subject matter is human being. I would like to say that the challenge for me as an imam is to be able to bring the book, the text, in the context. And to do so, that some of the interpretation of the Quran that we've seen in all the traditions, sometimes they may not answer the question to the average American Muslim or average American period. And therefore you have to be able to integrate, they call it integration of interpretation. And using any one interpretation would do the book a disservice. Not the linguistic interpretation by itself, like the Zamakhshari, or the Rai itself, like Razi, or the tradition, like Ibn Kathir, or the Batini, like Ibn Arabi, or Ishari, like Al-Ghazali. You have to be able to integrate those interpretations for a person that might ask or want an answer from the book. Because each one of them addresses a particular angle of the book. But the book is as a whole. You have to be able to look at all the sides of it. And that's the best way to look at it. And I can say to you that many people find the Quran appealing to them because the Quran answers what they call the ultimate questions in philosophy. That answers things that make a person wonder about what purpose of life, why I'm here, why I'm going after this. And not only that, even the previous text, Quran telling us that the Torah was revealed to Moses, answered those ultimate questions. The Bible was revealed to Jesus, it answered those ultimate questions. Therefore, the purpose of revelation is to answer them. And that led me to say that I do believe the most important aspect of the Quran is to define what they call the core values and core concepts. Because everything else revolves around those concepts. And if a person gets to know those core concepts and values, you find them to be universal. It doesn't need that much interpretation to begin with. Other things I'd like to say that the Quran is a book that meant to transform individuals. And one of the most important impact of the book is the transformation that did to the Arabs and did afterward that to the history of mankind. And that's why the Quran is not a book of information, it's a book of transformation. And it's all the scriptures like that. The purpose of the message of Jesus and Moses and so forth is to transform human beings and to have them to adhere to what I call them the values and virtues that make them reach high level of their potential as a human being. And one of the things that I just would like to comment on, and on all the things that have been said here, that there's a triangle when you approach the Quran. The issue of rational, which is aql, is very important in the Quran because Quran uses the word ya'qilun, ulil albab. Therefore, there's an invitation in the Quran for thinking. All over the Quran. As a matter of fact, when I said earlier that the subject matter of the Quran is human being, God Almighty in the Holy Quran calling people to contemplate on the history of mankind. Because you cannot be able to understand the Quran if you don't understand human narrative. Where it comes from and what people have done before us and human behavior. And that's why the Quran says, قُلْ سِيرُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ فَانْظُرُوا كَيْفَ كَانَ عَاقِبَةُ الَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِكُمْ. Say, walk and contemplate on earth to see what happened to people before you. And then Quran gives us psychological analysis of human behavior, or inviting us to understand human behavior. And when he says, وَفِي أَنفُسِكُمْ أَفَلَا تُبْصِرُونَ, many people look at this verse that you should contemplate in your existence. They look at this verse from the biological aspect, like the medical aspect of the very fascinating creation of human being, the eyes and the kidney and the heart. That's true. But he has a reflection on you as a human being. The subject matter again is a human behavior, understanding that how humans interact with one another, interact with the divine relation. Therefore, this is the aspect of aql. Then the aspect of the spiritual aspect of the Quran, spirituality, where people say, I recite the Quran and I feel calm, I feel good, which the Quran says, which is the spiritual experience of the Quran. And this is what the Quran itself says, part of the experience of knowing the book is to live the book, or to experience it in a way that when you practice it and so forth, you get another meaning of understanding of it. And that's what Imam Shafi'i used to do when he was a scholar. He said that he spent the night contemplating one verse, praying with it, praying that night with one verse, instead of a chapter or a whole surah. That he says next day he will get to know meaning of it, have not known before. Because contemplating on it in the spiritual state, make you have more realization, understanding of it. Now, I'm going to be very precise. I'm going to before you give me a note. Okay. I will try to do that. Great. So that I will correct the record that the Imam ended before all the guys. Now, the Quran also in Surah Al-Shura that explain what the purpose of the book again. We reveal to you the spirit from us. And Imam Al-Suyuti says means that the person have to live the living book in order the book to be living. I explained myself here that he said in order for the book to be living, the person have to live it to be a living, because the book in itself is not living. What he said, it's a living text. What do you mean by that? It has to be a living, but somebody living it. Otherwise, it's not a living text. And finally, I would like just to, suggest maybe something here that regarding of the English translation of the Quran. Your last point. One of the things that you have to remember that when the Quran being translated in different language, the person who translates the language from Arabic to English, he or she, they put their understanding, not only linguistic understanding, but where they come from theologically. If a person is, a Sufi, you're going to feel Sufism in it. If a person is Salafi, you're going to feel Salafism. If the person is Sunni, the person is Shia, the person is Ahmadi, you're going to see that in the book, in the translation. Because they project the tafsir in the translation. That's one of the things that you have to realize when you read the Quran. If I can say one thing about it, and the research I've been doing, even the method how to recite the Quran, I come to know, I'm writing on this subject now, there's something called tajweed. Tajweed means the method of recitation of the Holy Book. You have to recite it in particular science. The Quran differs itself from the Arabic language of the time of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, by name itself differently. Like the Arab, they used to name the poem, they call it qasida. Quran called the chapter surah. Arab have not used that before, naming their speech. The verse of the poetry called bayt. The verse of the Quran called ayah. The end of the rhyming, they used to call that the qafiyah. Quran called the end of the verses fasila. For it named itself differently. But more interestingly, that the way that you say the Quran, you don't recite a poet who's tajweed. I made research on this. People said Lughat al-Arab. But the Quran made a different way of reciting it. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, when he spoke other than the Quran, he did not speak like that. And the proof of this, a man by the name of Mas'ud, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, he heard the man reciting the Quran. He said, this is not how the Prophet Muhammad recited. He said he used to make the vowel longer. And therefore, I did the research on this, and I come to know that the method of recitation has something to do with the interpretation. You know what I mean? There's an emphasis. If I say, sit down, then I say, sit down. This language, the way I speak, has something to do to let you understand what I mean by that. Although it's two statements, a similar statement, but being said differently. Can I give you an example of that so you can think about it? I know this is a very specialized area, so that don't bore you by this, but I'm excited about it. For example, the story of Joseph. The story of Joseph, when they discovered that the woman, the wife of Aziz, was wrong, the family said, Yusuf, forget about this matter, don't talk about it. And you ask God for forgiveness because you have wronged yourself. There's the emphasis of the speech given the lady. I'll tell you in Arabic. Yusuf أعرض عنها واستغفري لذنبك إنك كنت من الخاطئين. One of them is quick, like, okay, let's close this, brother. The other says, you can feel in the story itself, there's more emphasis of speaking to the lady than speaking to Yusuf alayhi salam. And I have to try to translate that to English one day. But there's emphasis in the speech itself. The speech is not just a speech. That's why my last final recommendation, Muslims and people of other faith, when you want to understand Islam, they want and study Arabic language. Because it's the only way you can understand the text in the original meaning. Thank you.
Themes of Surah Al-Hujurat, literalism and tafsir and ta'wil, and maybe soundscapes of the Qur'an as well. Questions?
Thank you all very much. That was really excellent. My first question is to Dr. Zainab Adwani about Surah Al-Hujurat, the title. You said that you believe the title of Al-Hujurat has to do with the theme. So, what is the connection between the title and the theme?
In this, of course, is for all the source. That's what also I meant about the connection between, there's a connection between the title itself and also the core or the main principle of the surah. But in this one, I'm still working on the real connection between the two. Maybe I find something different. But really what it was, because there's some kind of the story itself that the people who came to visit the Prophet, and those, they were described in that surah, and specifically ayah 4 and 5, about those people who they come and distracted the Prophet at that time when he was resting. And not only distracted him, but the way also how they addressed him. They were calling him, and the story tells us about that. It showed more about their disrespect to the Prophet. And why, the questions here, why it was mentioned specifically, they called him, they called his name behind his hujurat. And hujurat itself, of course, it's some of the translations is like departments, and the other ones is viewed, or the houses of the wife. It wasn't even houses, it was also hujra. And hujra, it's more, it seems like it's a room. It takes that meaning. So there is something that it connects between the concept of the main theme and also why this privacy. We have to respect the privacy of our leaders, maybe. So still it's under constructing the questions more to come back and forth with the surahs. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this informative panel. I wanted to ask a question, possible to comments. Since Maria's presentation, I think by now, Maria, I think you like my books, at least. So your question about how dare human beings comment on God's word, that struck me because coming back to Nursi again, he talks about how to approach it in the utterance. And he says we usually tend to focus on the content of what's being said, but there are other things that are essential to active interpretation. So it's not just what is being said, but it is said and to whom, and in what context. That all factors into it. So it's time when we, or believers, let's say, when believers refer to the Qur'an as God's word, that's a little too short, actually. God's word to humanity. So because God is not speaking to himself there. That is himself speech necessary to humanity from the get-go. So then that question maybe helps us with that paradox that of course human beings will try to understand because it's meant to be for them. It's not about decoding God's personality in that sense. And then my question is, why would you say Surah Duha when it has second person singular?
Yes.
God has forsaken you, he's not with the orphan, and so you were very confident in the way you said this is for Muhammad. Clear. But I'm trying to read for myself as well. Why would you say this is for Muhammad?
Well, I was talking about commentaries are very clear there about saying we need to understand this in the context of something that's going on in the Prophet's life.
I see, so you were referring to okay,
Yes.
I thought you were thinking
No.
Because to me, like, if it's all mainly primarily for Muhammad, then why is it not a private interaction, some email or something? Why is it public? Why is it public? Why is it public? Why is it very clear? Even if it's in a singular second person, this is a passage to be recited to others, so it has a public.
Yeah.
But
Very good question. A couple of things. I'll start with your second one, which is, of course, one of the things is when you read the Qur'an, we have second person singular and second person plural, right? So there's cat and there's also hum. And not always, but in most places where it's singular, the commentators say that this is a direct address to Muhammad, to the Prophet Muhammad. We have a problem in English when we translate this because we don't really have a second person plural, except if you're from the South and we have y'all, or whether you're from, like my husband, he's from New Jersey, where you have yous. But other than that, we don't really properly have that. So that's, that was a kind of contextual clue, I think, for commentators to say, well, here they're speaking to the Prophet Muhammad specifically, and here it's speaking to the Mu'minun. But it was, that verse was sometimes, they had a little bit of problem because it describes him at one point as Dalun, as having been, misguided or something like that at one point, and there's a lot of discussion about that. But I think that what I was trying to say is that if you were to read it and you were going to have the commentary be really important to you, you'd say, all right, I want to know this. This is at a time of the Prophet's life when there had been a long time since he received a revelation. He was wondering what happened. He thought maybe he'd done something wrong and God had abandoned him. And that gives you a context for that verse. But if you sort of rely too heavily on that, it mutes, I think, the way in which you can read that and say, yeah, there are times when I may not be an orphan, but I felt like an orphan. Or there are times when I felt like I was misguided, and or the hereafter will be better for you than now. It could be the hereafter, or it could be maybe tomorrow will be better for you than today, also, right? So I think there are ways in which that can speak to people, and you wouldn't want to cut that off. With regard to your first point about, of course, this is addressed to human beings, and so it's an attempt for human beings are meant to try to attempt to understand it. One part of the paper that I didn't have time to talk about was in a lot of Islamic discourse, I've seen it a lot in Shiite discourse, although it probably appears elsewhere too. You have this bringing together these two terms, tanzil and ta'wil. So tanzil is the Qur'an that descends, and ta'wil is, of course, the interpretation. But if you think about it, it's like a movement. Tanzil is literally a coming down. So the tanzil is almost like a rope. The habl matin, the rope that's come down here, so that we can come back up, right? So this sense of ta'wil as an effort that one can apply to the tanzil, these sort of two movements, an attempt to understand the origin, to go back as a result of this tanzil that's coming.
In the back?
This is an opinion question for all of you, but specifically to Dr. Dia. You mentioned before that the 4th and 5th century scholars that they understood the futility of their work in Talmud.
I wouldn't say futility, but
Not
go ahead.
close off that door. Why, in your opinion, did they do that instead of saying, let's leave? I don't want to say it. I don't want to get into issue for a full interpretation of the Quran. But why would they vote to go given multiple interpretations rather than explaining to the people why it's important to understand multiple interpretations to even come to a multitude of interpretations on their own? For the idea of researching and growing with the Quran. That's the case.
I'm not sure I understand your question correctly, so tell me if I'm not answering it. I mean, so someone like somebody, for example, so he'll give multiple interpretations, but he very often will say, I think this one is the one that's most, it's ashab, it's the one that's most, right, right, so, but I think, again, I think it's this act of humility. I think it's this way of saying, this might be what I think is the best, and he'll give you very good reasons why he thinks this is the best interpretation. But he won't use that to cut off the other interpretations. He makes sure they're there. And even then, he'll say, Allahu Alam. Right? God knows best, because he doesn't want to close off that possibility. He doesn't want to say, I'm the one who can tell you that this is what God really means here, right? So was your question, though, why wouldn't they talk about the importance of accepting multiple interpretations?
Either accepting multiple interpretations or using multiple interpretations for oneself rather than seeking the ta'wil from a scholar, from somebody. So what I'm really asking is, why would they not advocate for the education of the individual in accordance with the Quran, rather than having an individual turn towards a multitude of scholars to explain to them why they should understand it in this way or this way or this way? That's really my question.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that's a very good point and a very good question. I think that first of all, I think there was they can understand. They certainly understood that the Quran meant lots of things, and maybe things that there's lots of traditions about the Quran having 7 levels of meaning or 70,000 levels of meaning. So they accepted that in principle. But even to say that the Quran can have many, many, many readings, it can't mean anything. It can't just mean anything, right? I mean, so that there are things that are just wrong, you might say. And I think that they wanted to make sure that there was a limitation on this, that people didn't just say that it meant whatever they wanted it to mean. One of that verse that I quoted, 3:7, one of the interpretations about those who seek to seek the ta'wil of the ambiguous verses, and they seek fitna thereby. The argument was that such a person comes to the Quran with a particular ideological perspective, and then they find what they're looking for in the Quran, right? That's the idea, and that's what's wrong. And so they wanted to make sure that if people did find multiple interpretations of the Quran, it wasn't because they went there looking for something very specific.
I see several hands up, but I'm going to ask, is there a question for any of the other 2 panelists as well? Because I can ask a quick question to Dr. Rahman, who's here from Qatar. I want to know, maybe if you could elaborate very quickly, and then we'll come back. We're over time, but we can take about 5 more minutes. The examples that you gave, in which Ibn Hazm does not read the Quran literally, like ask the village or the calf, enter their hearts, or the wind destroys everything. Those don't have legal import. It's a way that they read the language in a non-literal sense. And my understanding was that Zahirism was more in their legal doctrine. So are there also examples where there's some legal ayah that they interpret non-literally?
No, I wouldn't say so, no. In fact, most of the examples that I found had to do with qasas al-Quran, or this theme of the Quran, not the legal issues. In fact, Ibn Hazm believes that the legal verses are very straightforward. Even this kind of non-literal reading are not required to understand those verses.
Okay.
Perhaps the nature of the verses themselves are different. It's not because Ibn Hazm reads them in a different way.
Right.
The verses themselves are different in nature from the verses that speak about other things.
It might be interesting to classify the verses that they are open to non-literal readings by the Bible.
That's correct.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. Kathleen.
I just wanted to address your question based on my experience with Tabari specifically because yeah, I'm addressing his question about the multiple interpretations because I dealt with the text of the Tabari, which has different opinions or interpretations, and most of the time it's very much repetitive. So you have 10 or 11 pages of different people saying more or less the same thing. So at one point it's very boring, you actually sleep on the book. However, it was very important because I was also dealing with other interpretations for more modern scholars, and it was more synthesis and what they think. They would mention some ideas from previous scholars, but it's more their own synthesis. I felt that the Tabari is giving me the classic reference, something that I can always go back to and see the sea of it's more objective as well. Despite that he gives his opinion, but it's more objective. And from another sense, sometimes he would say something, say it in a sentence or half a sentence, and it would just open up the door for you. Like I remember one of the things he mentioned, a relationship between the Ummi Prophet and the Ummah. And it was just a sentence that he put there and he didn't comment on it at all. I don't know where it came from. And it just opened the doors for me in my research, and I totally came up, with a whole new brand think or thought. So it actually also, for later, the people who develop later, in time, and you see something, maybe he saw it but limited, and now I can see it for somebody else in a more, comprehensible, more thinking deeper. So it does also, despite that it's very classic and boring in a sense or more, but it offers new ideas as well.
I think we'll just take Anne-Sylvie and Ahmad-Din and then close the session with the final word from the panel.
Thank you. It was just to follow up with the discussion with Maria about when the classical scholars list different options or give different possible interpretations. I was wondering, was it also a way of saying, well, all interpretations are fine as long as they respect the mind of the Quran and keep following the Dhamma wishes?
Yes.
Would you say this?
Yes. Of course, really, they, one of the things that they do very frequently, of course, is they bring other verses to comment on the verse. So they do tafsir al-Quran with Quran. They bring other verses together, and I think that was, in addition to the historical context, that was really important for me reading those, because they would sometimes bring verses together that I would never have thought of to bring in connection with one another and really elucidate the verse. So yes, there is the idea, it's not anything, so it has to be certainly within the context of the Quran. The Quran can't mean something in one place and have it be completely contradicted somewhere else. Yes?
Yes, regarding this question about why the scholars give a list of alternatives but don't go so far as to leave it open-ended for the reader to add to the list, I think it's pretty obvious it's because they saw that as their job and they didn't want the uninformed to be involved in what they consider to be a process that required expertise. Having said that, I think there's a medium position between ignoring the scholars and being chained to their past interpretations. And since you're such a big admirer of ambiguity, I would present this.
Oh my gosh, I hope this doesn't go.
No, I am too. I want to present a hadith that I think it has some ambiguity that can be applied to the situation. It's a hadith usually quoted with regard to what is the right thing to do. But I think it could be applied to what is the meaning of the Quran, which asks what is the right thing to do. The Prophet suggested you had to do 5 things in order to arrive at the truth. You had to read the Quran, you had to listen to the opinions of the scholars. You had to ask your heart, ask your heart, ask your heart. And I would humbly propose that when you're reading the Quran, the
I just want to say that my observation of how people deal with the Quran, sometimes what the Quran asks us not to do, we do. Which is Allah says, God, the Quran says, وَاتَّخَذُوا Quran عِبْرِيًا, meaning dividing the book, and isolating the text, the verse from the entire the book itself. And therefore, the method of approaching the Quran has to be what the President alluded to, this wahdat binayya, that means you have to look at the Quran as one unit. And we do every morning tafsir of the Quran after morning prayer in Adam Center. We read the Quran in order, we finish it. Now, this is the third round. Before the people in the congregation will understand what's being recited. And I come to know, for example, for a few months now, we're reciting chapters will have a similar beginning. And when I was reading the tafsir, the interpretation of the Quran by other Muslim scholars, it's very interesting that if you open Tabari, it will be mentioned many times. Tabari, by the way, in my following warning, he said, but Tabari really put a lot of emphasis. Like he really worked hard on the text, I believe, although he disagreed with certain things, but but he will not interpret a verse that have been interpreted before. Again, he will say, Sabaqat tafsir. And I have interpreted before. And I ask myself, why did he do that? You can have cut and paste. Why did you do it again? And I come to know because he wants you to go to the first time that he mentioned. By doing so, to go to the first time this been mentioned appeared in the Quran, you will understand why it's been repeated. You understand the connection between this and the one before it. And it's very interesting also that you may ask yourself, why didn't God Almighty in the Quran repeat the verses? Because one of the purposes of the Quran is a reminder. Look at the Quran like a manual, something that you read every day. If you read it every day, and if I say to my children, I love you, and I love you, I tell them actually every day. I tell my children, my wife, and I tell my wife before my children that I love her, and sometimes I say, here goes again, but because you wanted to leave no doubt in the mind of the person you're speaking to, the Quran repeats itself, or God Almighty when He speaks, mentions things many times because the idea is that you don't read it once. You read it every day, and when you finish it, you start it over again, and when you finish it, start it over again. So those concepts sink in the mind of the person and the heart of the person. The last point I'd like to make is that I do find very interesting when an average person who's not specialized in the Quran, the sister said the Quran meant to be for every person, he comes to you with really profound meaning of the Holy Quran, of a verse that you never thought about, you never read it in the book. But he or she, by reading the verse, they read it so many times, they brought it to you, they said, wow, really? I'm not looking at it this way at all. Because he came to it, as the Imam was saying, that was open heart. When it comes to open heart, the Quran itself is generous. It's supposed to give the person who really came into it was open mind and open heart. And when you learn from the average person, like I'll give you one example, a Bedouin, for example, came to Medina for the first time and heard man reciting the Quran. And the guy, or the companion reciting the Quran, made a mistake. The Bedouin said, this cannot be God speaking. He cannot conclude the verse like this. The verse, who are you? He said, I'm a person that's come to Medina for the first time. And the man decided and looked back and says, yeah, you're right. It was Ghafur Rahim. It was not most forgiving, most merciful. Therefore, there's that aspect of human being and understanding the book also is in the book. It doesn't have to be scholarly and a person have to know everything. But language, context, and so forth help the person to come to meaning. As the professor, she said that it cannot be everything goes. That's why.
At the end of this conference, it's just we have to ask ourselves, I think, several questions. But it's just what Imam Majid mentioned about Qur'an. It's this ultimate divine invitation to every one of us to reconnect and this to have this intimate relationship with the Qur'an. And that kind of intimate, it means spiritual, intellectual, even our experience and the experiences of the previous commentaries, mufassirin, scholars, even the experience of the non-Muslims, the other histories, the previous histories of humanity, the experiences of our brothers and sisters of from the other faiths, communities. Also, it should be taken seriously in our experiences while we are engaging with the Quran. And I think I really thank God, of course, first for this conference, and I would like to thank every one of you to have this kind of very rich intellectual, spiritual experience, and I hope we will continue this kind of efforts with the help of all of you, of course. And please send us your feedback, and in this case, we will have the final session that will connect everyone who also thoughts and ideas. Thank you.
Thank you. Please join me. I have an organizer that you've seen, so I think all the key organizers are here. One more round for we'll reconvene at 4:30. Is that okay? 20-minute break. And then talk about the future, and there'll be concluding remarks by Dr. William.
Go ahead.